Brando didn't mean anything or wasn't the most looked up to guy, when we were working and acting. They're lying. He was the guy.
I would love to learn from him. I found acting with him one of the most pleasurable times I've had.
Marlon Brando gave a legendary performance in The Godfather, but things weren't so smooth behind the scenes. He felt hurt and let down when his co-stars didn't back him up during fights with the studio over some factors. Brando already didn't trust Hollywood much, and feeling alone made it worse. Even though the movie was a huge hit, those feelings of betrayal stuck with him. Let's dive deeper at why he stayed bitter toward his Godfather co-stars. I refuse to forgive. Marlon Brando was, without a doubt, one of the most enigmatic and complicated figures in Hollywood history. When you think of Brando, you think of legendary performances, A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and of course, The Godfather. But behind his Oscar-winning portrayal of Vito Corleone was a man who was deeply suspicious of the people around him, especially his fellow actors. As iconic as The Godfather is, Brando didn't walk away from that movie with warm feelings for everyone involved. In fact, he reportedly never forgave some of his co-stars, and the reasons weren't about petty jealousy or standard on-set drama. They went deeper, touching on artistic respect, personal betrayal, and Brando's own complicated standards. Let's start with one of the biggest sore spots for Brando, Al Martino, who played Johnny Fontaine. Martino wasn't a trained actor, he was a singer, and Brando didn't have much patience for people who weren't up to his level when it came to the craft of acting. During a famous scene where Fontaine breaks down in Vito's office, begging for help getting a movie role, Brando was reportedly genuinely frustrated with Martino's performance. According to behind-the-scenes accounts, Brando thought Martino's acting was so bad that it made the scene unbearable to shoot. That slap across the face in the "you can act like a man" scene? It wasn't just acting, that was Brando's real frustration boiling over. He couldn't stand how Martino was slowing things down, and he didn't hide it. But the tensions didn't stop there. Brando had a long memory, and part of that included remembering how people had treated him in earlier parts of his career. One example involves a separate production, Julius Caesar, where he acted alongside Anthony Quinn. The director at the time, Elia Kazan, allegedly manipulated Quinn into thinking that Brando had talked badly about him. This led Quinn to be cold and distant on set. Brando later found out the truth and felt hurt that Quinn never tried to clear the air. While this wasn't directly connected to The Godfather, it shaped how Brando interacted with other actors and reinforced his belief that Hollywood was full of backstabbers. He came into every project, including The Godfather, with a shield up, already half-suspecting betrayal from his co-stars. Brando was a man of principles, and when those principles were crossed, he didn't let it go. He famously rejected his Oscar for The Godfather in 1973, not out of arrogance, but as a political protest. He sent a Native American activist, Sachin Littlefeather, to the ceremony in his place to decline the award on national television. That moment shocked the world, but for Brando, it was consistent with how he lived, always standing up for what he believed in, even if it meant clashing with the very industry that made him a star. He didn't just play characters with a moral code. He tried to live by one, even when it made things messy. On the set of The Godfather, there was also a power struggle happening behind the scenes. Brando often clashed with studio executives and was even threatened with being replaced during early pre-production. He stood his ground, but he never forgot how close he came to being pushed out. That kind of pressure and disrespect from the people in charge likely colored how he viewed the entire experience, including his relationships with the rest of the cast. Even if some of his co-stars admired him or looked up to him, he may have lumped them in with the system that he believed was trying to control and exploit him. If we turn tables, was he a perfect actor to work with on set? No. His co-stars and even the crew had problems with him too. Even the rest had issues with each other. Brando was at the center of a lot of the drama. Sure, he was a legendary actor, But by the time The Godfather was being made in the early 70s, Brando had a reputation for being difficult to work with. He was unpredictable, often showed up late, and sometimes didn't show up at all. Director Francis Ford Coppola had to fight tooth and nail just to cast him in the first place. The studio didn't want him because of his erratic behavior and the fact that his recent films hadn't done well. Eventually they agreed, but only if Brando did a screen test and worked for a reduced fee. Brando reluctantly accepted, and once he was on board, things got even more complicated. Brando was a master of method acting, but his methods were unconventional, to say the least. He famously stuffed his cheeks with cotton during his screen test to create Vito Corleone's distinct look and voice. On set, he refused to memorize lines and preferred to have cue cards hidden around the set. That didn't sit well with some of his co-stars, particularly Al Pacino, who was still early in his career and trying to prove himself. Pacino was very serious about his craft and reportedly found Brando's improvisational style frustrating and even disrespectful. But despite the tension, the two managed to create magic on screen, maybe because of the friction, not in spite of it. Speaking of Pacino, his casting was a major point of conflict. The studio didn't want him. They thought he was too short, too unknown, and didn't have the leading man presence they were looking for. They pushed for more established actors like Robert Redford or Warren Beatty. Coppola, however, had a vision for Pacino as Michael Corleone and stuck to his guns, even as the studio constantly threatened to fire both him and Pacino. Pacino himself felt out of place and insecure during the early days of filming. He later admitted he thought he was going to be fired at any moment. The fact that he eventually stole the entire movie with his cold, calculated transformation is a testament to how good direction and raw talent can rise above backstage politics. Then there was James Caan, who played Sonny Corleone. Caan had a big personality, and that often clashed with others on set. He reportedly didn't get along too well with Pacino either. The two had very different styles. Caan was loud and physical, while Pacino was internal and controlled. That difference shows up on screen in a good way, but behind the scenes, it sometimes created awkward or tense moments. Caan also had a habit of messing around on set, which didn't always go over well with the more serious actors and crew members. Despite all these problems, or maybe because of them, The Godfather ended up being a masterpiece. Sometimes, friction between co-stars can create a kind of electricity that translates into powerful performances. That definitely seems to have been the case here. The film's legacy is untouchable, but it's fascinating to think that it came so close to falling apart so many times. Whether it was Brando's stubborn genius, Pacino's slow burn intensity, or the off-screen clashes that fueled on-screen chemistry, the behind-the-scenes drama is almost as compelling as the story we see on film. Did he have beef with his co-stars in The Godfather? The answer is yes, but it wasn't about diva behavior or jealousy. Brando didn't trust easily. He didn't respect people who he thought were phoning it in, and he didn't forgive people who broke that trust. Brando's refusal to forgive some of his Godfather colleagues wasn't about grudges for the sake of drama. It was about deeper wounds tied to his idealism, his passion for acting, and his lifelong struggle with feeling misunderstood. A master in a masterpiece. Brando's performance in the movie isn't just famous, it's legendary. It's the kind of acting that gets studied, quoted, parodied, and admired endlessly, even decades after the film came out. When The Godfather was released in 1972, it didn't just change Brando's career, it shifted the entire landscape of American cinema. Brando was already a big name by then, sure, but this performance didn't just revive his fame, it turned him into a myth. Let's back up for a second briefly. Before The Godfather, Brando was a bit of a Hollywood cautionary tale. He had exploded onto the scene in the 50s with powerhouse roles in A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and The Wild One. He was young, intense, and different from anything Hollywood had seen before. Like mentioned, Brando brought method acting into the mainstream. He wasn't about slick performances or flashy stardom. He was about raw, emotional truth. But by the late 60s, his star had faded. His films weren't doing well. Studios thought that he was too difficult to work with, and he had a reputation for being unpredictable and even self-destructive. Some people thought he was finished. But then came The Godfather, and everything changed. Coppola had to fight to get Brando cast as Don Vito Corleone. The studio didn't want him. They thought he was too much of a liability, too expensive, too much drama. But Coppola, as the director, believed Brando was the only one who could bring the necessary gravitas and complexity to the character. Brando, in turn, didn't just show up to read lines. He became Don Corleone. For his screen test, he stuffed tissues in his cheeks, slicked back his hair, and lowered his voice into that now famous husky murmur. That voice was Brando's own creation, inspired by his idea that the Don was a bulldog who had been wounded and spoke softly because of the pain. Right from that moment, it was clear he was onto something special. When the movie hit theaters, Brando's performance blew audiences away. Unfortunately, some people just knew him because of Godfather. Still, it's a win-win situation. He didn't just play a gangster, he played a man. One with pain, pride, wisdom, and a deeply rooted sense of family. The character of Vito Corleone wasn't loud or showy. He was quiet, thoughtful, and incredibly powerful in his calm. Brando's slow, deliberate gestures, stroking a cat while talking business, pausing before giving orders, made him both terrifying and strangely tender. That's part of what made the role so magnetic. You could believe that this was a man who could order a murder with one word, but also play with his grandson in the garden and kiss his wife's hand at the dinner table. He was fully fleshed out, complex, real. What's crazy is that Brando's dialogue wasn't even the loudest or flashiest in the film. Some of the most memorable lines, like, "I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse," are delivered in almost a whisper. But those whispers carried more weight than most actors' shouting matches. Every scene Brando was in had a kind of gravitational pull. Other characters would orbit around him, and you couldn't take your eyes off him. That's not something you can teach in acting school. That's something Brando just had. Of course, the fame that followed was massive. The Godfather was a smash hit, critically, financially, and culturally. It wasn't just another gangster movie. It became one of the most respected films of all time. And at the center of it was Brando, once again the king of Hollywood. His performance won him the Academy Award for Best Actor. But in true Brando fashion, he didn't accept it. Instead, he sent a young Native American activist, Sachin Littlefeather, to decline the award on his behalf and speak about Hollywood's poor treatment of indigenous people. It was shocking at the time and controversial, but it made a statement. It reminded people that Brando was never just about fame and fortune. He was about principle, art, and often rebellion. Ironically, by refusing the Oscar, Brando only increased his mystique. It made him even more unforgettable. He wasn't just a great actor. He was bigger than Hollywood. He became this untouchable, legendary figure, both admired and a little feared. Directors and actors worshipped him. People started to imitate the Don Corleone voice everywhere. In comedies, parodies, commercials, his performance had become instantly recognizable, even to people who hadn't seen the film. That's when you know you've created something timeless. But what really sets Brando's performance apart is how deeply it connects with people. Vito Corleone isn't just a mob boss. He's a father, a leader, a man with regrets. He's someone who built a life for his family the only way he knew how, even if it meant doing terrible things. And Brando makes you feel that conflict in every scene. You don't just see a criminal, you see a human being. That's what great acting does. It doesn't just entertain you, it moves you. It's also worth noting how Brando's performance elevated everyone else in the film. Al Pacino, James Caan, Robert Duvall, they were all fantastic, but there's something about Brando's presence that raised the entire film to another level. He gave the movie its weight, its heart, its soul. It's impossible to imagine The Godfather without him. Even after all these years, Marlon Brando's portrayal of Don Vito Corleone is still considered one of the greatest performances in movie history. Film critics, scholars, fans, they all keep coming back to it. And it's not just about technique or craft. It's about the way Brando made the character feel alive, layered, and unforgettable. He didn't just act the part, he lived it, and the fame that followed wasn't fleeting. It was the kind of fame that cements your legacy forever. Brando's performance in The Godfather didn't just make people take notice of him again, it made them realize he was in a league of his own. It reminded the world what true screen presence looks like. It reminded everyone that acting at its highest level isn't about big moments or loud scenes. It's about honesty, control, and depth. Brando gave us all of that and more. And that's why, even today, you hear that raspy voice and instantly know you're in the presence of greatness. Beyond Godfather. The Godfather is usually the first title that pops up when people think about Marlon Brando and box office success. And fair enough, the movie wasn't just a financial hit, it was a cultural moment, a movie that defined an era and turned Brando into an icon all over again. But to limit Brando's box office legacy to that one film would be selling him short. Brando had a long and varied career, full of peaks and valleys, but many of his films, especially in the 50s and 70s, were major commercial successes. Even when his off-screen behavior raised eyebrows or his films drew mixed reviews, people still showed up to watch him. He had that rare ability to draw a crowd, whether he was the lead or just making a brief appearance. One of Brando's earliest and most significant box office hits was A Streetcar Named Desire in 1951. This film adaptation of the Broadway play brought Brando's raw, magnetic stage performance as Stanley Kowalski to the silver screen. At that time, Brando was a fresh face in Hollywood. He hadn't yet become a household name, but the moment people saw him in Streetcar, something clicked. His intensity, physicality, and naturalism were unlike anything most moviegoers had ever seen. Audiences were mesmerized, and the film made big money, especially for a serious drama. It wasn't just an artistic triumph. It was proof that Brando could carry a film commercially. That same year, he also appeared in Viva Zapata, a more modest success, but one that helped build his image as a serious, socially conscious actor. Then came The Wild One in 1953, which may not have been a massive financial hit by modern standards, but it became a cultural phenomenon, and it definitely made its money back and more. In this movie, Brando played Johnny Strabler, the leader of a motorcycle gang, and delivered the famous line, "What are you rebelling against? What do you got?" The film tapped into something electric in post-war American youth culture. Young audiences saw Brando's brooding rebel as the embodiment of nonconformity. His leather jacket, his slouched posture, the mumbling. Suddenly, everyone wanted to dress and act like him. While the box office numbers were solid, the film's real value was in how it turned Brando into a pop culture icon. It didn't just fill theaters, it shaped attitudes. Only a year later, in 1954, Brando starred in On the Waterfront, one of the greatest films of its era, and a massive commercial hit. This is where he gave his legendary "I could have been a contender" speech, a scene that's been parodied, quoted, and analyzed endlessly ever since. The film wasn't just successful because of Brando, but his performance certainly didn't hurt. He gave depth to a working-class character that felt real to audiences. The movie swept the Oscars and drew huge crowds, both for its story and for the buzz around Brando's performance. This wasn't just a win for him, it was a box office and critical home run that cemented his place as one of Hollywood's top leading men. He followed that with Guys and Dolls in 1955, which paired him with Frank Sinatra. Now, here was Brando in a full-blown musical, a role that no one really expected him to take, especially since he wasn't a trained singer. But guess what? The movie made big money. Audiences were curious to see Brando try something different, and the film delivered. It showed that Brando had real star power, enough to bring people into theaters no matter what genre he was tackling. Even if critics were mixed on his singing, his name on the marquee was enough to guarantee a successful run. Fast forward to 1962 and Mutiny on the Bounty, one of the most talked-about films of that decade. The production was famously a disaster behind the scenes. Delays, cost overruns, and stories of Brando clashing with the crew. The press had a field day. But despite all that, the film turned a profit. Brando played Fletcher Christian in a role that was supposed to be heroic and tragic. Even with all the drama off-camera, audiences still showed up to see what the fuss was about. International markets especially helped the film recoup its massive budget. Brando's star power remained strong, even if his reputation was starting to shift toward the difficult genius label. After some career stumbles in the late 60s, Brando returned to box office glory with Superman in 1978. His role as Jor-El, Superman's father, was brief but incredibly lucrative. He reportedly earned around $3.7 million for just a few minutes of screen time, setting a record at the time. Studios knew that Brando's name would add weight and credibility to what was essentially a comic book movie, a genre that wasn't yet seen as prestigious. The gamble paid off. Superman was a monster hit, one of the biggest box office successes of the decade, and Brando's presence played a key role in getting audiences excited about the film. Even if he wasn't the star, he helped make the movie feel important. Then there's Apocalypse Now in 1979. Talk about chaos. The movie had one of the most famously troubled productions in Hollywood history, and Brando showed up overweight and unprepared for his role as Colonel Kurtz. But somehow, it worked. Brando's mysterious, eerie performance in the final act gave the film an almost mythic quality. Apocalypse Now went on to become a huge critical and commercial success. It grossed tens of millions globally and is still considered one of the greatest war films ever made. Once again, even with all the problems, Brando's name helped bring people into theaters. There was something about him, unpredictable, enigmatic, that kept audiences hooked. And even into the 90s, Brando proved he could still draw a crowd. In The Freshman, he basically spoofed his own Godfather role alongside Matthew Broderick, and the result was a surprisingly clever and commercially successful comedy. The film didn't break records, but it was profitable and reminded people that Brando could still have fun with his legacy. It was almost like he was in on the joke, and fans appreciated that. Looking at his overall career, it's clear that Brando wasn't just a great actor. He was a legitimate box office draw across multiple decades. Whether it was in a gritty drama, a musical, a war epic, or a superhero blockbuster, Brando had the kind of presence that made people buy tickets. Sure, he had some flops, too, like The Island of Dr. Moreau or The Missouri Breaks. But even in those, his performances were often the most talked-about part. The ups and downs were part of the ride. What mattered was that when he was on, people showed up. He had that rare magnetism that crossed genres, generations, and even cultures. His filmography is packed with examples of how his star power could elevate a movie, drive sales, and leave a lasting mark on audiences around the world. And how did he reach that point? Let's know him on a deeper level. Life before film success. Marlon was born in Omaha, Nebraska. He was the only son of Marlon Brando Sr., a traveling salesman, and Dorothy Pennebaker, an actress who spent a lot of time away working in theater. With both parents frequently absent, Brando grew close to the family's housekeeper. When she eventually left to get married, the young Brando felt abandoned, something that would deeply affect him. He had two older sisters, Jocelyn and Frances. Despite playing many famous Italian characters in movies, Brando didn't actually have any Italian roots. His background was a mix of German, Dutch, English, and Irish. One of his ancestors, Johann Wilhelm Brandau, came to New York from Germany in the early 1700s. He also descended from Louis Dubois, a French Huguenot who arrived in the 1600s, and from Miles Joseph Gahan, an Irish immigrant and Civil War medic. Brando later expressed a strong connection to his Irish heritage, so much so that during a 1995 interview in Ireland, he said it was the happiest he had ever felt, and that he was seriously considering becoming an Irish citizen. In 1930, when Brando was 6, the family moved to Evanston, Illinois. There, he became known for mimicking others and pulling pranks. He also met Wally Cox, who would remain one of his closest friends until Cox passed away in 1973. When Brando's parents split in 1936, his mother took him and his sisters to Santa Ana, California. They moved back to Illinois 2 years later after his parents reconciled, settling in Libertyville. Brando went to Libertyville High School, where he was good at acting and sports, but struggled academically. He ended up repeating a year and was eventually expelled in 1941 for behavioral issues. His father then enrolled him at Shattuck Military Academy, which he had also attended years before. Brando kept up with acting there, but in 1943, he got into trouble after defying an officer. Although students supported him, the faculty voted to expel him. He was allowed to return the next year, but he chose to leave instead. After that, he worked digging ditches during the summer at a job his dad helped him get. He also tried to join the army, but a previous knee injury from playing football kept him from passing the physical exam. Looking for a new path, Brando followed his sisters to New York City and started studying acting. He enrolled at the American Theater Wing Professional School, part of the dramatic workshop at the New School, where he learned under the well-known German director Erwin Piscator. In a documentary called Marlon Brando, The Wild One, his sister Jocelyn said Brando had been in a school play and realized it was one of the only things he truly enjoyed. That experience inspired him to seriously pursue acting at age 18. According to his friend George England in a biography episode, Brando found a sense of belonging in New York, something he hadn't really felt before. People encouraged him, which was a big change from how he'd been treated growing up. At first, he stayed with friends and even lived for a while with Roy Somlyo, who later became a successful Broadway producer. Marlon Brando was a devoted student of Stella Adler, who taught him acting techniques based on the Stanislavski system. This approach encouraged actors to dig deep into both the emotional, internal, and physical, external parts of a character in order to bring them to life with authenticity. Brando showed an impressive level of insight and realism from the beginning. Adler used to tell a story from one of her classes where she asked the students to act like chickens facing an incoming nuclear bomb. Most of the class flapped around in a panic, clucking and running, but Brando stayed still and pretended to lay an egg. When Adler asked why he chose that reaction, Brando simply replied, "I'm a chicken. What do I know about bombs?" That moment showed his ability to think differently and deeply about character perspective. Although many people label Brando as a method actor, he himself didn't like that label and openly criticized one of its most famous promoters, Lee Strasberg. Brando made it clear that he learned nothing from Strasberg and didn't hold him in high regard. In fact, he accused Strasberg of being self-centered and trying to take credit for actors' success without actually contributing much to their craft. Brando said that while he occasionally visited the actor's studio, mostly when Elia Kazan was teaching or when he wanted to meet women, he never considered Strasberg his teacher. For him, it was Stella Adler and later Kazan who truly shaped his acting. Brando was a game changer in terms of film acting. He brought a raw, natural style that was unheard of at the time. According to actor Dustin Hoffman, Brando would often keep chatting casually with people on set, even after the director had yelled, "Action!" He wouldn't start the scene until he felt his delivery was as natural and relaxed as his offhand conversation. Brando believed acting needed to be real, not stiff or rehearsed. In his documentary, Listen to Me, Marlon, he even joked that actors before him were like breakfast cereal, predictable and bland. Some critics thought this made him difficult to work with, but his co-stars saw it differently. They understood it was just Brando's way of creating truthful, believable performances. Have you watched the film yet? Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe for more interesting uploads.